In the fall of 1866, just as the last leaves clung to the sycamores outside Hollow Pines Academy, a man stepped off the mail coach wearing polished boots, a pressed wool coat, and the gentlest of smiles. His name, written in elegant script on the arrival ledger, was Dr. Percival Murney. He carried no trunk, only a leather satchel that buckled tightly at the mouth. The boarding school had sat quiet through the war years, first emptied by conscription, then repurposed as a field infirmary, and finally reclaimed as an institution of Christian virtue in the so-called rebirth of the South. But its walls still held the scent of chloroform and sweat, and something in the woodwork always sounded like it was breathing. Murney was appointed headmaster by private letter. No public search, no vote. The founder, Reverend Joshua Calden, had died months earlier in what the town called divine sleep, his hands clutched to his chest as if holding something no one could see. The board insisted Murney was a man of quiet discipline and medical grace, having served as a field surgeon for the Confederacy, and later volunteered with missionary hospitals in Georgia. What no one mentioned, what the local papers were too afraid to print, was that none of those hospitals kept records of his service, nor could anyone quite remember who recommended him. The children were told to line up on the chapel lawn as Murney passed through them like a drifting shadow. He offered warm nods and faint praise in a voice just loud enough to hear but too soft to grasp fully. His eyes lingered too long on the quiet ones, the ones who flinched at noise, the ones who chewed the inside of their cheeks or refused to meet his gaze. Obedience, he told the staff in his first meeting, is the beginning of health. They nodded. They wanted structure. The war had left them frightened of chaos, frightened of themselves, and so when Murney replaced the dusty hymnals with his own hand-bound prayer books, they accepted. When he locked the infirmary for sanctification, they assumed it was necessary. He called the children his blooms, said healing was a garden that required pruning. The teachers began avoiding questions. One whispered in passing that the new headmaster walked the halls barefoot after curfew just to hear how the floor responded to weight. Another said his room smelt of burnt wax and something else, something dry and metallic. But Murney smiled through it all. Gentle, calm, courteous. The first weeks passed quietly, too quietly. The morning routines sharpened into silent meals and wordless scripture. The school bell rang more often, but it no longer marked time. It marked obedience. In the attic, a heavy rope had been added to the old chapel bell. Staff were not allowed to pull it anymore. Only Murney, and always at dusk. On his third Sunday, he invited a select group of students to sit with him in the old sanatorium wing. They returned pale, unfocused, and unusually docile. One boy refused to eat for 3 days but insisted he felt cleansed. When asked what happened inside, he simply stared at the ceiling and whispered, "I heard the sickness fall out of me." Some faculty grew uneasy, but none dared confront Murney directly. His charm, like a glass pane, allowed them to see only what they wanted: tidiness, poise, doctrine. They were tired of screaming children and fractured faith. They wanted order. Murney offered it. What they didn't realize was that his version of order was something colder. Not discipline, but dissection. Not structure, but sterilization of the soul. He didn't need to be punished. He simply observed. Quietly. Precisely. Like a man charting symptoms he already knew the final cause of. He started every morning with a list in his notebook. 5 names rewritten each time in different ink. The students were not told why they were chosen, but each was called to his office before breakfast. Sometimes they returned by lunch. Sometimes not at all. In whispers, the staff called it the rebuilding, a phrase that made them feel faithful again. But underneath the linen prayers and the polished floors, Something old and damp was waking, something that remembered pain and liked the taste of silence. Murney, with his gentle eyes and spotless hands, had not come to lead. He had come to correct it, and Hollow Pines would never breathe the same again. By the second week of Dr. Murney's tenure, the comforting rhythms of Hollow Pines Academy began to twist into something harsher, though few could point to where the change had begun. The warm milk that had been served with bread each morning vanished from the routine without explanation. In its place came early chapel and kneeling prayer, prolonged and breathless, with no cushion allowed between floor and bone. When a boy named Caleb dared to whisper his hunger to a classmate, he was made to kneel in the corridor from dawn until dusk, his knees blistering against the slate. Murney explained, calmly, that hunger was not a punishment. It was proof the body still clung to sin. To desire nourishment before purification, he said, was to invite rot, and rot must be drained. Students who coughed or sneezed during lessons were asked to stand and confess their inner wrongs before they could sit again. One girl had a nosebleed after slipping on the stone steps. Murney claimed it was judgment leaving her too soon and placed her on 3 days of silence. No medicine, no bandage. Just a white cloth pinned to her collar marked with the word unclean in faded red ink. The stains never quite washed out. The infirmary remained locked, though its shutters were open now and then, letting pale light pass across the dust-lined windows. Murney began recording names in a narrow leather notebook he kept tucked into his sleeve. The entries were never discussed aloud, but the students soon learnt what they meant. Those whose names appeared more than once were moved to different dormitories, quieter dormitories, rooms where no one returned with the same voice. Some came back sleepwalking, others couldn't stop scratching their arms even when blood dried beneath their fingernails. Murney explained to the faculty that these changes were signs of moral expulsion and should be welcomed. He praised obedience and called silence the first sound of salvation. Teachers once known for their gentleness began parroting his phrases, not because they believed, but because they feared what it meant to question them. The war had left them broken. This new order, cruel as it was, at least had shape. Soon labels replaced names. Children became the lean one, the mouthy one, and the slippery soul. Murney would point at a student and ask softly, "Do you feel the sin climbing inside your bones today?" If the child hesitated or cried, they were pulled from class and not seen until evening prayers, when they stood pale and shaking behind the pulpit reciting psalms in cracked voices. Even the strong ones began to fall quiet. No one dared limp, no one dared wheeze. They held in coughs until they choked on them. Pain became private, illness became shame. One morning, as frost spread like breath across the chapel windows, a girl named Elsie Ruth stood swaying during prayer. She was small and often overlooked, one of the drifters, as Murney called them. Her eyes fluttered, her lips trembled, and then she dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. Her body hit the chapel floor with a sound that silenced even the hymns. But no one moved. Murney remained kneeling, his fingers laced before him. When a teacher stepped forward, he held up a hand. "Let her be," he said, for her spirit had been starved long before her flesh. The others returned to prayer. Elsie lay still. The stone beneath her slowly pulled the warmth from her bones as dusk settled through the windows. No blanket was fetched, no doctor summoned. She stayed there until morning. Behind the west wing corridor of Hollow Pines, beyond a creaking wooden door sealed with rusted brass, hung a pair of long black velvet curtains that pooled at the base like spilt oil. They were too thick for sunlight to pass through and always cold to the touch, even in summer. Students whispered that it used to be the old infirmary, back when bandages and opium soothed fever instead of sermons and silence. But no child had been treated there since Murney arrived. The space beyond the curtains had no windows and was never shown during inspection rounds. Still at night, when the halls quieted and prayers finished, some children swore they heard sounds from inside. Faint, wet sounds like cloth being wrung out. Others described whispers so soft they bled into dreams. A few said they heard singing, but the melody didn't follow any hymn they'd ever learnt. It rose and fell in uneven notes like someone humming through clenched teeth. The faculty insisted the room was being sanitized for eventual use, and that old mold and infection still haunted the floorboards. But none of them ever carried cleaning tools. They walked past it like it didn't exist, averting their eyes as if glancing too long might pull them inside. One night, a boy named Peter Lyle claimed to have seen Murney enter the curtain room barefoot, carrying only a wooden bowl and a coil of what looked like piano wire. Peter was known to exaggerate, so most ignored him. But later that week, he was found sitting alone in the chapel, eyes wide and mouth packed full of cotton wads. He never spoke again. Children began referring to the infirmary only in riddles. The brave ones called it the hollow, others the backward room. No one dared go near it alone, even during daylight. Yet the staff acted as if nothing had changed. Except for one thing, Murney began calling it the correction chamber during his morning lectures. He spoke of it casually, as if it were just another desk, another tool in the pursuit of discipline. He said some spirits required private tending, that certain illnesses of the soul needed stillness, quiet, and focused removal. He said the room had been blessed with emptiness. That phrase stuck with the children in ways they couldn't explain. Weeks later, the names of 3 students, Marjorie Lorne, Isaac Dale, and Samuel Boone, were read aloud during breakfast, marked as disruptive to spiritual progress. No specific behaviors were cited, no punishments announced. But after the meal, Murney asked the 3 of them to gather their shoes and follow him. He smiled as he said it, the kind of smile that asked for trust while offering none. The rest of the children watched in silence as they walked behind the velvet curtains one after the other. The drapes were drawn shut, and no sound followed. Not at first. Only much later that night did someone hear a muffled scraping, like wood being dragged across stone, and a soft, choking sound that ended too abruptly. The 3 children did not return by morning. Dr. Murney began his 4th week at Hollow Pines with a lecture no one forgot, though most tried. Standing at the front of the assembly hall with the windows shuttered tight, he introduced what he called the doctrine of drains. Illness, he said, was not caused by germs or poor hygiene, as the worldly physicians believed. It came from within, from bad thoughts left to pool too long in the blood. He explained calmly that children especially were vulnerable to these moral fluids. Fear collected along the spine, he said, like algae in a gutter, lies swelled behind the gums, forming abscesses the soul could feel but the mouth could not confess. Temptation settled in the soles of the feet, making even a simple step sinful. It was not enough to pray, he warned. Prayer only stirred the toxins. They had to be drawn out, removed, purged. For the health of the spirit, for the good of the body. He described the human vessel as a leaking basin, meant to spill when tended with precision. The staff watched from the sides with hollow faces. No one interrupted. By now, even the bravest teachers had stopped asking questions. That evening, the school blacksmith, once a quiet old man named Virgil who sharpened tools and fixed railings, was seen hauling crates into the curtained infirmary. They clanked like cages, but didn't rattle the way iron usually does. Over the next few days, students were summoned one by one for adjustment. They returned pale and altered. Small clothes were rolled and packed into their mouths during meals. The matron claimed it was to stop teeth grinding during sleep, but some bled at the corners of their lips even before nightfall. The younger ones walked stiffly, avoiding touch, and flinched when someone stood too close. Their backs were rigid, curved in odd angles, and always hidden beneath extra layers even when it was warm. One child was found standing in the garden long after dark, barefoot, unmoving. His heels blistered and ringed with dark lines like something had been cinched too tightly around them. He wouldn't say what had happened, only that he had dripped enough for now. Murney kept a cabinet in his office filled with devices he never bothered to lock. He claimed secrecy bred suspicion, and truth was a cure. Inside were tools of his own design. Long needles with curved shafts, hollow copper tubes that narrowed to a pinprick, bone clasps and restraints carved with runes no student could read. He called them facilitators, and referred to them in the same tone one might use for surgical instruments or communion plates. The doctrine of drains was not meant to hurt, he insisted. Pain was simply proof the release was working. The children stopped arguing. They stopped whispering. Some even began asking to be drained as if it might lessen the weight they couldn't name. And soon the halls echoed with the slow steps of students walking with unfamiliar caution. Backs welted, gums packed, and souls burnt clean. It began with a single bowl and a candlelit hymn. Dr. Murney introduced the ritual during a morning chapel service, his tone calm and patient, as though he were explaining arithmetic or the difference between wheat and chaff. He said the devil had taken root in the bellies of children, nesting in the folds of their weakness, coiled in the shame of their hunger. This devil, he claimed, fed on comfort and thrived in the quiet indulgence of digestion. To cast it out, the stomach had to be made holy. And so a new sacrament was born. He called it purging, though no Bible verse ever named it. Sickly students, or simply those who spoke too much or blinked too often, were chosen first. They were led down the aisle barefoot, hands folded, eyes lowered. One by one, they were handed tall glasses of what Murney called purifying milk, a thick chalk-colored liquid with the scent of sweet oil and lye. The children were told to drink until the glass was empty, to welcome the burning as proof of evil being separated from flesh. The chapel doors were locked during the ceremony. No one was permitted to leave once it began. Copper bowls were placed at the base of the pulpit, polished to reflect the faces of those kneeling above them. After drinking, the children knelt in rows, waiting. When the pain began, Murney would raise his hand and signal the organist to play. Hymns swelled through the space as stomachs clenched and mouths opened. What followed was violent, humiliating, and repeated. The children retched until their bodies folded. Some cried, some collapsed, but the rules were clear. No one was to speak. Vomit was collected like an offering. Murney walked among the kneeling children with his hands behind his back, eyes scanning the copper bowls as if inspecting them for signs of progress. He occasionally knelt beside a student, whispering something they would never repeat. When it was over, each child was given a linen cloth to wipe their mouth and sent back to class without water, without comfort, without acknowledgement. The ritual became weekly. Staff were instructed to prepare the liquid every Thursday before dawn. No one dared refuse. The scent of soap and kerosene became part of the chapel now. Some students began vomiting before they drank, as if their bodies had learnt to anticipate the cleansing. One child, after her third session, bit down so hard during the purge that 3 teeth loosened from her jaw. Then came the girl. Her name was Beatrice Alden, a quiet thing with sunken cheeks and knotted hair. She drank slower than the others but did not resist. She purged like the rest. She knelt like the rest. But when the hymn ended and the bowls were cleared, Beatrice did not rise. Her hands were still folded, her head resting against the lip of the copper. Murney approached, knelt beside her, and placed a hand gently on her back. Then he rose and declared her cleansed. The word echoed with unnatural finality. Beatrice was buried the next day beneath the apple trees behind the school. No announcement, no mourning. Just a small stone placed above her grave with one word etched into it, emptied. The other children were told to give thanks. A soul had been purified, and the orchard would now grow sweeter. Miss Evangeline Harper had once believed in hollow pines. She had come to the academy as a teacher of scripture and language, eager to restore order and gentleness to a world broken by war. She had stood in that chapel when Murney first arrived, had clapped politely during his opening sermon, and had even nodded along when he spoke of obedience as medicine. But now, weeks later, something inside her had gone quiet. It wasn't just the children's strange behavior or the unbearable stillness that blanketed the halls. It was the absence of anything human beneath it. No laughter, no questions, no mess. The children had become polished artifacts of someone else's vision, and she was starting to realize that someone was not well. She began writing letters to her sister, tucked between lesson plans and blank hymn sheets. She described the new rituals in plain terms, but added phrases only her sister would understand. She wrote that the milk made them burn, that the prayers no longer reached heaven, that the curtains in the infirmary swallowed sound. She sealed each envelope with wax and passed them to a groundskeeper she trusted. But days turned into weeks and no reply came. She sent 7 letters. None returned. One night, long after curfew, Evangeline crept into the supply hall to retrieve extra blankets for 2 sick girls in her dormitory. On her way back, she noticed Murney's office door was ajar. She never intended to look. But something about the candle flickering inside pulled her forward like gravity. On his desk sat a stack of folded papers tied in blue string. Her stomach turned as she read the first name, her sister's, written in her own hand. The letters were all there, every word, unopened, stolen. She never heard Murney enter the room. He stood behind her, expression unreadable, fingers folded gently against his stomach. He told her softly that emotional instability was expected in women of her constitution, that her dreams, if left untended, could become infections. He said he would help. He always helped. The next morning, Evangeline did not attend breakfast. Her class was reassigned without explanation. The students who passed her room later that day said they heard a sound like slow weeping, muffled behind fabric. Over the following week, she was seen wandering the garden paths at odd hours, her hair unpinned, her sleeves stained. Her gaze drifted when spoken to. She no longer made eye contact with children. She scratched at her arms during meals. Murney informed the staff she had been diagnosed with female hysteria, an affliction caused by overexposure to moral conflict. He said she would be treated with silence and stillness until she rebalanced. He gave no end date. Her belongings were removed from her room by 2 older students. Her journals burnt in the chapel furnace. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the orchard, a boy passing by the infirmary heard Evangeline whispering to herself. He stopped and listened through the keyhole. She wasn't praying. She was reciting names of children, names that didn't belong to anyone left at the school. By midwinter, the bell no longer marked the passing of days. It marked obedience. At exactly 2 a.m., it began to toll, once, twice, then a long pause, calling the children from their cots into the frozen black of the courtyard. The first time they thought it was a mistake, a fire drill, or a cruel prank. But when Dr. Murney appeared in his gray overcoat, hands clasped and eyes bright with calm purpose, they understood it was something else. He called it soul calisthenics, Said sleep was where the devil festers, where thoughts turned poisonous and dreams opened doors better left shut. He said the body must be kept moving to keep the spirit clean. Those who moved slowly were helping rot take root. The children were ordered into rows, barefoot, their nightgowns clinging to thin skin, breath rising in pale clouds. The ground had turned to freezing mud crusted with ice along the edges. They were made to march in circles, knees high, arms lifted, eyes forward, no talking, no whimpering. If one stumbled, they were corrected with a sharp strike from a switch dipped in brine water. The sting seared more than skin. It lingered in the nerves like something that didn't want to leave. The first few nights left the children shaking but conscious. They returned to their beds soaked and blue-lipped, unable to sleep even when allowed. But the ritual deepened. The sessions grew longer. Murney introduced chanting, repetitions of cleansing phrases, spoken until tongues swelled and cracked. They marched until their ankles bled. He instructed them to stomp temptation out of their souls, to flatten doubt underfoot. Some children began collapsing mid-circle, their bodies folding like wet cloth. He never yelled, never rushed. He simply walked among them, reminding each child that pain was progress. The staff watched from the edges, some wrapped in shawls, none stepping forward. There were no blankets issued afterward, no fire lit. Only silence and the soft drip of melting frost from the chapel roof. Then came Tobias, a quiet boy, thin but obedient. He rarely drew attention and never disobeyed. One night, during a particularly long session, he tripped over a root frozen in the mud and fell forward, his teeth snapping together on impact. Blood trickled from his chin, but he stood and resumed his place without complaint. The next morning he was unable to speak. No sound came from his throat, not a whisper, not a breath of song. The others thought it would pass. A few days of rest, maybe a poultice. But Murney refused to excuse him. He said Tobias had swallowed something during the fall, something poisonous from within. He called it a spiritual blockage. Said speech was dangerous when unfiltered. Tobias remained in silence for weeks. No treatment, no comfort, just isolation and constant observation. He was kept alive, but no one ever heard his voice again. When asked a question, he pointed. When corrected, he blinked. When it was time for calisthenics, he marched, always in rhythm, always without sound. Miss Evangeline had grown used to the silence in Hollow Pines, the kind that pressed against the ears and settled behind the eyes. But something new had crept into it lately. A tension, a feeling that the walls themselves were listening. She moved with more care now, her footsteps lighter, her breathing shallow. Murney had begun locking his study, but locks only protected those who believed rules meant safety. Late one night, as snow ticked faintly against the chapel glass, she crept through the east corridor with a wire hook and a prayer she no longer trusted. The study door opened with a reluctant sigh, as if it had been waiting for her, and inside the air felt stale, like something preserved too long. His desk, large and heavy, was bare on the surface. No ink stains, no clutter, just a single cloth napkin folded into perfect corners. But the bottom drawer, the one with the brass handle worn smooth by fingertips, gave her pause. She opened it slowly. Inside were rows of small wooden trays, each lined with soft cotton and fitted with objects that at first looked like odd stones or soap carvings. But as she leaned closer, the truth hardened in her throat. They were teeth, molded in wax, each one an exact replica down to the curve of a root or chip in enamel. Dozens of sets labeled with names she recognized, students who had vanished or changed or fallen silent. Isaac Dale, Marjorie Lorne, Samuel Boone, even Beatrice Alden buried in the orchard with the word emptied carved above her head. The wax was pale, almost translucent, and some still smelt faintly of milk and iron. But that wasn't what made her stomach turn. It was the carvings, Symbols, delicate and deliberate, etched into the molars, etched into the canines. Some looked like runes, others like twisted letters from an alphabet no language had ever claimed. One tooth had a hole bored through its center, as if something had been pulled out of it. Another had been painted red along the gum line and still shimmered wet, though no hand had touched it in weeks. Her fingers trembled. She reached for a small tray in the back labeled only Tobias. A single molar cracked near the root. As she lifted it, it twitched. Just once. A soft insect-like shift beneath the cotton. Evangeline recoiled, heart hammering against her ribs. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though something unseen had leaned in close behind her. She didn't think so. She grabbed the nearest set, Beatrice's, and staggered out to the hallway. In the chapel furnace, she lit the wax teeth with a trembling match. The fire caught fast, faster than it should have, hissing with an oily sputter. The smell was sweet and wrong. And then came the scream, high and ragged, not from outside, not from the wind, from within the chapel itself. One long, choking wail that pierced the hymn-stained silence and stopped as suddenly as it began. Evangeline stood frozen, her hand still raised, the wax already blackened. In the cold stillness that followed, she realized something had changed. Something had felt it burn. Something had been watching her long before she ever opened that drawer. It began on a Thursday morning just after frost had settled across the chapel windows, and the orchard looked like it had been dusted in bone. The dining hall was half empty when a teacher noticed something strange. 11 children, none from the same dormitory, none with recent punishments, were not seated at breakfast. Their beds were neatly made, slippers aligned perfectly beneath the frames. Their absence wasn't unusual. Children fell ill, were summoned, or simply vanished for hours. What was strange was how they reappeared. That afternoon, as classes were dismissed, students passing through the southern corridor of the East Wing froze in their tracks. 11 children moved slowly down the hall, each walking backward with eyes shut tight, lips quivering with sound. Their movements were synchronized and unnervingly fluid, never colliding with furniture, never touching a wall. The whispers came first, dry and rhythmless, syllables that didn't belong to the mouths that spoke them. At first, the teachers assumed it was a prank, a punishment choreographed in secret, but then someone recognized the words. Not English, not any familiar tongue, Latin. Broken and half-pronounced, but Latin nonetheless. Phrases not taught at Hollow Pines. Phrases that, when later translated, included words like invert, descend, and open beneath. The children were gathered in the chapel and examined for injury. None responded to questions. They remained calm but unreachable, heads bowed, shoulders relaxed as if they had just woken from a dream they hadn't yet left. When asked if they remembered walking, none could describe it. Murney watched all this without concern. He claimed it was spiritual reorientation, a natural side effect of progress. He said the children had become unclogged, that their inward compass had reversed. He instructed the staff not to interfere. He told them correction sometimes required disassembly, that the soul does not always move forward when it heals. From that day on, the 11 were exempt from morning drills and afternoon lessons. They moved as a group, always barefoot, often in places no one expected. On the chapel roof, along the orchard's edge, inside closets no longer used. They spoke only in murmurs, fragments of a language no longer taught by man. Within days, other students began copying them, clumsily at first, hoping to gain attention or favor. But something always stopped them short. The real 11, as they were soon called, moved with an unnatural grace, like they were being pulled. A few began twitching during sleep, speaking in partial Latin phrases without understanding. One boy broke his arm trying to walk backward down the staircase. Murney said that was proof of weak faith. He reminded the others that copying purity without purification was blasphemy. In quiet corners of the academy, some staff confessed to feeling sick when they watched the 11 too long. Headaches, nausea, a buzzing behind the eyes. Miss Evangeline refused to look at them all together, muttering that their eyes, when opened, seemed older than their bodies. One night, just after the soul calisthenics concluded and the courtyard had emptied, the children were counted again. 10. One was missing. Her name was Clara, a quiet girl, the smallest of the 11. Her bed was untouched. Her slippers are still warm. But no one spoke her name, not the staff, not the other 10. Murney made no mention of her absence, and when a teacher asked, he tilted his head and asked gently, "Which Clara?" The question fell like a stone in water, rippling outward until even those who remembered her face began to doubt their own certainty. The remaining 10 continued their backward path, their eyes still shut, their whispers unchanged. Clara was never seen again. Her name was never listed in the records. But the next morning, one more wax tooth had been added to the drawer in Murney's study, small, chipped at the edge, and painted with a smear of ash along the root. By early spring, Dr. Murney no longer referred to the children as students. He called them vessels. It was spoken plainly, almost fondly, as if he were proud of the new terminology. He lectured that illness was no longer a mystery. It had shape, scent, and weight. He said it left the body through salt, through sweat expelled in moments of stillness and suffering. He compared the body to a sponge soaked in sin and said it was the Academy's duty to wring it clean. The doctrine of drains had evolved. No longer content with bloodletting or purging alone, Murney began what he called the harvesting phase. Students were selected without warning, pulled from meals, mid-lesson, or sleep, and taken to the furnace wing. Inside a row of bricked closets originally built for drying firewood, he had installed narrow benches and hidden wall vents connected to steam pipes from the kitchen. The children were stripped to their underclothes, wrapped tightly in thick woolen blankets, and placed inside the heated space for hours. The door was latched from the outside, no windows, no clocks. Just warmth that turned quickly to suffocation. He said heat revealed what cold concealed. That sweat was the body's final truth. The process left them gasping, disoriented, weak-limbed, and reeking of ammonia. But their sweat was never discarded. It was collected. He placed small ceramic jars beneath their chins and elbows and padded cloths at their necklines to soak excess. Everything was preserved, nothing wasted. He labeled each jar with a brass tag. Name, date, time of entry, and a phrase in Latin that no student could read but which appeared again and again, ex ossibus lux, from bones light. The jars were stored in a cool chamber beneath the east stairwell on long wooden shelves that smelt faintly of brine and beeswax. Each child had their own row. Some had dozens of entries, some had only one. None were told why. Then came the tastings. Once a week during inspection hour, students were summoned to the chapel altar in pairs. Murney would select a jar at random, unseal it, and dip a long-handled spoon into the thick liquid at the base. The student whose name was etched on the tag was made to taste it, just a drop, placed on the center of their tongue and held for 5 full seconds. The second child would watch and then be asked to describe the reaction. They were to report whether the salt tasted heavy, bitter, metallic, or clean. Murney logged their responses in his black book, next to sketches of the children's mouths, notations of prior drainage procedures, and notes like improved taste, or scent dulled but still impure. If a child gagged, they were returned to the furnace closets the next morning. If they cried, they were given 3 jars the following week. If they said nothing at all, Murney smiled. Teachers were told this was a hygienic protocol, a new form of bodily literacy. He said understanding one's own self was a gift, but the children knew better. They knew it was a measurement of pain, of obedience, of something deeper that could not be seen in mirrors or marks. By April, the salt jars lined the entire lower basement wall. Some glowed faintly under candlelight. Some had turned black at the edges. And still, more shelves were added. The space no longer felt like storage. It felt like an altar, a place where the body was no longer punished for being weak, but studied, harvested, until nothing impure remained, or nothing human. The night Evangeline returned to the black-curtained room, the storm outside had turned to ice. The chapel bells had not rung that day, though no one dared ask why. Children had eaten without speaking, and the staff moved like shadows, silent, folded into corners. She waited until the dormitories fell into uneasy sleep and crept barefoot through the darkened corridor. Every step toward that door felt like she was walking against her own soul. But something inside her had already shifted. She could no longer pretend she hadn't heard what she heard 2 nights ago. The scream that broke from the chapel just after she burnt the wax mold labeled Beatrice. That sound had not come from memory. It had come from someone still breathing. And deep down, she already knew who. She slipped through the curtain with a quiet prayer clenched in her teeth. The air inside was heavy with something chemical, rot masked by lavender and salt. The walls were padded in stitched burlap, still damp in the seams. The cot in the center was narrow and low, surrounded by trays of tools too clean, too organized. A shape lay curled on top of the linen, small, still. When Evangeline stepped closer, she stopped breathing. Elsie Ruth, not a memory, not a ghost. Alive. Her eyes fluttered open but didn't focus, and her arms twitched under the blanket as though startled by her own skin. Her wrists were wrapped in gauze, and beneath the gauze were patterns, etched lines, small cuts, almost decorative. Geometric, repeating symbols. Concentric circles and sharp-angled stars carved shallow enough not to kill but deep enough to keep. Along her inner thighs and collarbone, the same designs. Murney hadn't abandoned her. He had preserved her, hidden her, used her. Evangeline knelt beside her and reached for her hand. Elsie winced but did not pull away. When Evangeline asked her name, the child opened her mouth. No words came, only a wet choke. It took a moment to see why. Her tongue had been sewn to the inside of her cheek. The thread was black, still taut. Dried blood lined the edge like a cruel seam. Evangeline wanted to scream. Instead, she whispered gently, asking for anything, any sign she understood. Elsie blinked once. Then slowly, painfully, she raised her finger and drew a shape into Evangeline's palm. A curve, then a line down, then 5 dots in a ring. The same symbol was burnt into one of the wax teeth she'd found weeks ago. The same shape was sketched again and again in Murney's black notebook. Then, from somewhere inside the torn stitch of her mouth, a faint breath squeezed through. One word, slurred, fragile. Hive. The word dropped like lead, not because Evangeline understood it, but because she did. Somewhere deeper than language. Hive. A place not of healing, but of collection. Not a school, not an asylum, but a system. An engine. A cathedral of silence built to harvest something no one dared name. She knew then that the rituals weren't random, they were steps. Each child was drained, burnt, reversed, extracted, and rewritten. It wasn't punishment. It was an order. And Murney wasn't mad. He was methodical. He was building something. She wrapped Elsie in a wool shawl and tried to lift her, but the girl collapsed against her shoulder like wet laundry. Too weak to walk, too broken to carry. Evangeline stood trembling, looking around the room for keys, for exits, for mercy. Instead, she found records, dozens of them, Journals labeled by year, by dormitory, by child, Marjorie, Isaac, Tobias, Clara, even her own name. Each page was filled with diagrams, test notes, and symbols, some that bled off the edges like the ink refused to stop. She didn't take them. She didn't need to. The truth was already inside her. She stumbled out of the room through the curtain and back into the hall with a plan already forming. She would take Elsie. She would run. At dawn, she would reach the town, find a constable, and alert the parish. But when she turned the corner toward the staircase, the corridor was already lit. The door at the far end stood open, and Murney was waiting. Calm, unmoved, as though he'd been standing there all night. His hands were behind his back, his face still. And in that moment, Evangeline knew she was not interrupting the experiment. She was part of it. She had always been part of it. The journal was bound in ash-colored calfskin, the spine stitched in uneven thread that looked hand-pulled. Its pages crackled as Evangeline turned them, brittle and thick, like parchment soaked in smoke. At first it read like a physician's log, symptom charts, behavior tallies, and seasonal records of illness and improvement. But within a few pages it veered. The notes became less about sickness and more about structure, not of the body, but of something Murney called the collective spirit web. He referred to the children not as patients, not even as vessels anymore, but as lattice points, coordinates in a living framework. Their bodies were anchors, he wrote, but their suffering. That was the signal that allowed transmission. He believed agony wasn't a side effect, it was the language. Within each cry, each flinch, each tremble under ritual pressure, the soul briefly detached from the self and became receptive. He described this state as the glow, and when multiple children glowed at once, through fasting, burning, draining, or reversal, he claimed their spiritual cores aligned, like a grid, like blood humming through wires. He called this phenomenon the hive, not metaphorically, but physically. He wrote that beneath the school, under the stone and soil and orchard roots, there was something dormant, something ancient and layered like sediment. Not evil, he insisted, just older than pain. It needed connection. It needed the energy only children could produce, not because they were weak, but because they hadn't learned how to lie to their own nerves yet. Each page mapped a different act of cruelty to a term he had created. The silence, the turn, the drain, the boil, the milk, the march, the backward song. Every punishment had a purpose. Every ritual is a place. Each one fed a node, and the nodes fed the hive. He even diagrammed proximity events, nights when more than 5 children suffered at once, and the walls reportedly pulsed, or the candles flickered without wind, or rooms dropped in temperature despite closed hearths. He described one incident where the floor beneath the chapel sang during prayer, but no one else heard it. He called these things moments where the hive got close enough to touch. And then, in a long, rambling passage halfway through the journal, he revealed his goal: collective enlightenment through shared threshold. He wrote that the human soul, when isolated, is nothing but static, but when broken together it becomes a conductor, not of light, not of salvation, but of something greater than mind, a signal born of unity and agony. He believed that Hollow Pines could become the transmitter, the first school of ascension, not through scripture, not through medicine, but through synchronized harm, and he believed he was close. Evangeline closed the journal with numb fingers. Her breath came shallow. The air in the study tasted sharp, like ozone before lightning. And somewhere deep beneath her feet, the stone floor gave a soft groan, no louder than a breath. Then came the smell, burning but not of wood. Not yet. She stepped into the hallway and saw the first flicker. Fire, blooming from the chapel staircase like it had not started but arrived. The bell rope above her head burst into flame without a spark. Doors swelled in their frames. The hive, it seemed, had learnt how to answer. When the smoke finally cleared, what stood where hollow pines once loomed was nothing more than scorched soil and fractured brickwork. The fire moved fast, unnatural in its precision. Consuming the chapel first, then the dormitories, sparing no beam or stone. The orchard trees burnt from the inside out, their cores hollowed like something had climbed up from the roots to escape. Myrnie was never seen again. Neither was Evangeline. Most assumed both perished in the flames, though no bodies were recovered, no bones, no clothing, just silence. For years, the land remained untouched. Locals avoided it, crossing the road to avoid the hill where the school once stood. No one rebuilt, no one gardened. The grass never returned quite right. In winter, frost refused to cling to the ground there. And in summer, bees swarmed and died in clusters, their bodies dried to powder by morning. 2 decades later, in the fall of 1905, a team of municipal workers was sent to clear the foundation for farmland development. They brought shovels and limestone and quiet jokes about ghosts. But within hours, the work halted. Beneath the old floorboards, just below where the infirmary had once stood, they found the first urn. Then another. Then 50 more. Each one is child-sized, sealed with wax and stamped with a brass number. Not names, not dates, just numbers. Inside there were no skeletons, only traces of ash, molars fused together by heat, and wax molds shaped like human teeth. Some were etched with carvings that no one could identify. One urn contained a ring of twine soaked in dark oil. Another, a fingernail pierced through a copper disc. Most had no scent, but a few reeked of something like burnt sugar and rust. The workers were instructed to stop digging and report directly to the county office. Officials arrived within days, declared the site structurally unsafe, and ordered it sealed. No investigation followed. The records of hollow pines had long since vanished. When asked about the academy, the state office replied only that it had closed due to structural failure and fire of unknown origin. No mention of students, no mention of staff. The names never made it to the public register. Even the ledgers kept by the local parish listed only "loss by flame" beside the school's final entry. When pressed by reporters years later, one official said it was better to let some places lie dormant. He called the site a spiritual echo chamber. The phrase never appeared again in any other document. The urns were quietly relocated to an underground vault near a decommissioned train station, where they remain to this day, unmarked and locked behind a rusted iron gate. The vault is monitored once a year for moisture and pest control. No further tests have been authorized. By 1921, lawmakers in Tennessee quietly passed legislation banning the use of spiritual medicine in private institutions. The bill cited a series of unnamed cases involving experimental faith-based treatments. There were no hearings, no debates. The law passed unanimously and was archived without ceremony. Most historians believe it was a reaction to wartime abuses. Others think it was an attempt to bury something older, something that didn't fit into textbooks. When asked about hollow pines, local elders still speak in fragments. One called it the place where children disappeared without going anywhere. Another simply said the ground there remembers. Today, nothing grows on that hill. The wind changes as you approach it, picking up as if warning you away. The earth sinks slightly where the foundation once rested, like the land is still trying to exhale something it can't quite name. No monument stands there, no marker. Just a rusted fence around the boundary and a small wooden post hammered deep into the soil with no writing on it at all. Those who notice it never remember what it looked like once they leave, and if you listen closely, just beneath the sound of dry leaves moving across stone, you can hear something faint. Not crying, not whispers. Just a low, steady hum. as if the hill still hums with the memory of a voice that never belonged to one child, but to all of them. The land is still now over 100 years later, but it doesn't feel at rest. Wind passes over the hill too quickly, never pausing, never circling back. Travelers who stumble across the site rarely linger. There are no fences anymore, only scattered pieces of the old foundation that jut through the grass like worn teeth. What stands in their place is a single stone plaque, smoothed by time and set into the earth with no ceremony. It bears no names, no dates, not even the word Hollow Pines. Just a carved prayer. May silence never swallow truth again. Most visitors don't understand it. They take a photo, shrug at the strangeness, and move on. But for those who've read between the lines of old ledgers and misplaced laws, for those who've studied the asylums that never reopened and the children who never made it home, the hill is sacred ground, and something more. Something unresolved. Murney was never found. No bones, no trace. His name vanished from records by 1910, struck from rosters, omitted from minutes, wiped clean like chalk after sermon. Some whispered he burnt with the school. Others believed he escaped, carrying the journal and its pages of ritual theory with him. One theory even claimed he dissolved into the hive itself, that in the final convergence he transcended the flesh he used so cruelly. But most simply chose not to ask. By the time private institutions were forced to register their faculty and disclose treatment methods in 1921, no one would admit knowing who he was. And perhaps that was his final mastery, not just hiding evil, but making it look so tidy, so rational, so compassionate, that no one could separate it from order itself. His evil never screamed, it whispered. And the world always listens to polite cruelty before it believes bleeding children. The letters of Miss Evangeline were thought lost. For decades, not a single page surfaced. The assumption was that she died in the fire, that her final thoughts had burnt with her. But in 1996, during a quiet renovation at a regional folk museum in Kentucky, a set of wax medical molds was pulled from a mislabeled box marked Appalachia, Orphan's Misc. One was a child's lower jaw, delicately cast in ivory wax, 2 molars missing, pink ribbons still attached. When the curator opened the back seam to inspect for preservation, she found a sliver of paper folded and tucked into the hollow space behind the front teeth. A single sheet. Fragile, browned with age, and written in the tight, careful hand of a school teacher trying not to be caught. It was addressed to my sister. The ink had faded, but the words could still be read. They call it cleansing, but it drains something colder than illness. The children are quieter now. Too quiet. He says they're progressing, but they move like they're already gone. If I disappear, I need you to know I tried to pull them back. I tried. It was signed simply E. The letter caused a brief stir, a short article, and a footnote in a historical journal about the dangers of experimental education. But no official reopening of the case followed. The vault containing the urns was relocated again, this time to a remote state repository under restricted access. The curator who found the letter requested permission to trace it, but her request was denied. She later reported that the wax jaw had started to degrade faster than expected, softening at the edges as if heat were trapped inside it. When she tried to preserve it, it crumbled completely in her hands. The museum quietly removed the exhibit. No replacement was made. Today, Hollow Pines is rarely mentioned by name. Its story lingers only in whispers among archivists, trauma researchers, and those who study the boundary between faith and madness. Some believe the school was an isolated tragedy. Others say it was only one branch of a wider tree, a failed experiment in collective transformation. No one can say how many schools like it may have existed in the aftermath of war, during years when children were plentiful and the world was still trying to decide what counted as progress. What we do know is this: evil didn't scream through hollow pines. It didn't wear a monster's face. It smiled gently. It measured suffering. It catalogued obedience. It studied pain like scripture and called the results holy. It whispered things that sounded like healing, and people listened. So now when we look at old photos of neat school rows and smiling instructors, when we read about treatment methods that were never reviewed, when we find blank spots in the maps of childhood institutions that once held hundreds, we have to ask ourselves something simple. Would we know the difference? If a man like Murney returned, if his voice were calm, his hands clean, his tools polished and rational, would we recognize it? Would we call it evil? Or would we again just call it discipline? What do you think? Could this happen again? Would we even recognize it if it did?